Hello and welcome to this social media training session delivered by London Museum Development. I'm Alec Ward, the Museum Development Officer for Digital and Communications, and today's session is going to be on social media. What can it do for your organisation? So as part of this training session, we've decided to gear it towards the current climate. Obviously, I'm talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to be looking a little bit at how other organisations are using social media platforms in the current climate, the sorts of content that they're creating, what you might need to do to create, similar content. We're also going to be talking a little bit about social media analytics and then also a little bit about social media strategy. But both the analytics and the strategy parts of this session are going to be followed on with some more in-depth training looking at social media strategy and social media analytics individually. So let's kick off with some examples of good and interesting content from the heritage sector. So something that I'm really enjoying at the moment is Culture Perth and Kinross Museums. They're doing a really great hashtag called Dougie Draws. And basically one of their events officers, Dougie, is quite talented at Microsoft Paint. So what they've been doing is through hashtag Dougie Draws, Dougie's been reimagining some of their famous artworks using Microsoft Paint. This is a really nice example of sort of harnessing the creativity from within organisations. This is something that they might not have done were it not for the lockdown and were it not for Dougie having a little bit more time on his hands, obviously without events happening at the museum. And they've got lots of examples of tweets that they've done using this hashtag, so definitely check that out. Another example that I really like, the Cooper Gallery in Barnsley have been creating museum jigsaws that people can play pretty much online. So they take pieces of art or photographs, collection items from their online collection store, and then they run it through a program that turns it into an interactive online jigsaw. And then people can complete the jigsaws at home. And they do these a few times a week. People can even time themselves on the platform, so you can see how long it took you to complete the jigsaw compared to other people. And again, this is a really nice example of how museums can be creative with the content that they currently have at hand. So collection items that they have on their collection online, they can be creative and imaginative with those. So this is a really nice example of that through hashtag museum jigsaws. York Castle Museum have been taking their weird and wonderful collections and encouraging their audiences to play a game of Lie to Me. So through hashtag Lie to Me, they share a collection item that's a bit interesting, a bit weird, and then they ask their audience to come up with inventive and creative reasons as to what this object was used for. So this here, for instance, somebody commented that it looks like the skeleton of a cat. I thought that was quite funny, and I thought it was a quite nice way to, again, be creative and imaginative with the collections that they have at hand whilst everybody's working remotely. But these are also lessons that you can take into your work as the lockdown is lifted, thinking creatively, thinking openly about the collections that you have at hand. You don't need to spend a huge amount of time creating new digital content. You just need to be creative and imaginative with the stuff that you already have. Doncaster Council are really good on social media, particularly on Twitter. And this is a nice example of knowing where your audiences both are and where your audiences aren't, or who your audiences are and who your audiences aren't. So again, it's a bit funny, it's a bit silly, but it's an example of Doncaster Council knows that teenagers who are likely to be using the skate park aren't going to be following them on Twitter. It's pretty likely that that's not going to happen, but because they're creative and because they're being fun, this could be picked up by magazines, newspapers, other web services. It can be retweeted, and it could be seen by the parents of teenagers or family members of teenagers who might find it funny, but then also say to their kids, look, the skate parks are closed. And again, another example of an organisation being creative in the way that it's sharing public messages. So this was around the time that a lot of organisations and institutions were closing their organisations due to the lockdown. Again, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, it's a bit funny, but it's also a really smart use of a meme. 3 points versus 3 contrasting points is quite a popular meme, particularly at that time. And again, it's a creative way of engaging audiences, because at the time there's a lot of organisations that were making these kinds of announcements. So they took this as an opportunity to tailor their content to help it cut through so that people might actually see it and might actually pay attention. Leeds Discovery Centre have been making some really great content online, particularly through Museum from Home, and they've been sharing that on Facebook. Again, these videos aren't, crazily technical. They're just talking about collection items, using the hashtag Museum from Home to share their collection. Something that I really like about it are that all of their videos are subtitled and captioned, so that they're more accessible. I think this is a really good example of that sort of creative but fairly simple content that can be created and shared on social media. This I absolutely love from Getty Museum. They started something called the British Oddity Championships for 2020. Obviously something that they entirely made up, but it was brilliant. They selected oddity collections from organisations across Britain, and then each different organisation, the oddity collections were pitted against each other and subjected to a public vote via Twitter. So every day or every few days they did these public votes, and people were able to vote on their favourite oddity, and then they went through championships. So they had like semi-finals and finals until eventually a winner was crowned, and it was the Old Operating Theatre that won. Something that I really like about this is the introductory video that they made. And then if you find this tweet, there's the video is really good, very well edited, quite creative, but also fairly simple to do. Something that the Getty Museum's been doing recently is recreating artwork from home. And I really like this example. Obviously the Getty Museum is a large organisation, but again, it's encouraging people to be creative with their collections. All they're really doing is saying, here's our stuff, get creative, be imaginative, do something interesting. And then, the Getty Museum has a large audience, but people really got involved. And it was also picked up quite heavily by, newspapers, written in articles, shared quite widely. So it got a lot of publicity. Again, Getty Museum. But that doesn't mean that smaller organisations can't do something similar if they're not creative about it. And again, thinking about that sort of audience participation, audience engagement, the Museum of English Rural Life created hashtag Animal Crossing, where they encouraged people in the Animal Crossing video game to create smocks. And basically in the game you can create custom designs, and one of those can be on a long sleeve dress, which is smock-like. So they asked people to create smocks and then share them using the hashtag Animal Crossing. And they got lots of people doing it, so many submissions that they actually created an online gallery of the best creations, which I thought was really excellent. And again, a really nice example of how you can know where different audiences are, know what your audience is up to. They knew that their audience, a large chunk of them would be playing Animal Crossing, because it was, I think, the most downloaded video game, the fastest downloaded video game and purchased video game potentially of all time, which, is quite a feat. But again, they knew where their audiences are and knew what their audiences were doing, so they decided to sort of tailor their content and create something that fits all of those molds. Barnsley Museum have been doing a really excellent Barnsley Bingo. And I like this because it's actually quite simple in concept. All they're doing is talking about their collection items. And the way that it works is he spins the tombola, picks out a ball, and then the number on the ball corresponds to the collection item. The collection item has a number as well. And then, he basically just talks about the item that was chosen, but the addition of the tombola sort of adds a slight element of suspense, a slight element of surprise, makes it a little bit more creative and a little bit more imaginative, and people will tune in to see this content. And it's been doing really well. As you can see, this video from the 20th of March had over 1,500 views, which is quite impressive for a museum. Again, thinking about that audience contribution, audience collaboration, the Ashmolean Museum have been doing hashtag isolation creations, where they share a collection item from their online collection platform, and they ask people to create something inspired by that collection item. So this is a small, looks like a hedgehog, and they ask people to get creative and be inspired by it and create something based on that. And again, I think it's a really nice example of how an organization can use the assets that they already have, so digitized collections, to be creative online and to get their audience talking, collaborating, and creating. So I think something that is going to be important to think about now, and could also be important to think about in the future, depending on what happens with lockdown and the virus, is to think about how you're going to go about reopening. So I've got a couple examples here. So the Royal Academy, a large organisation, of course, but they have been sort of littering their social media now and then with tweets that are sort of hinting about what they're going to do when they reopen. They say they won't reopen the doors until it's safe to do so, but they can let you know what's going to be going on at the RA when they do eventually reopen. And then they've just sort of shared information about the sort of things that you can see. And it's planting that seed that, yes, eventually we will be out of lockdown, and when we are, this is what you can come and do. Obviously, there's lots of other conversations that you might need to be having online, talking about, social distancing and plans for the organisation when it does reopen. But at the same time, you also want to be showing your audiences what's going to be happening, enticing them, keeping them interested, and aware that there are going to be things happening at the organisation. And again, I really like this from the old operating theatre. They created a thread, which was sort of like an online tour of the museum, but they started it by saying they want to give you a tour of the museum, but also an idea of how to actually get there. Obviously the tour was virtual, but the fact that they started that by saying this is how you get here sort of sows that seed for their audiences that, to remember that when the lockdown is done, this is how you get to the old operating theatre, and this is a place that they could potentially visit. So those were some really, different, interesting examples from heritage organisations and the types of content that they're creating at the moment. Obviously, it's a very unique time at the moment with COVID-19. It's something that we've never experienced before, so there are no hard or fast rules. But I think a lot of the lessons learned from the types of content that those organisations are creating are still relevant even without COVID-19, thinking about audience collaboration, thinking about being imaginative and creative, thinking about the assets that you already have and how you can utilize them without the need to make more and more content, I think are really important lessons to learn. And I think a lot of those organizations have managed to do that really well. But something that sort of ties into this are models of content creation. So I just want to really quickly talk about these three models of content creation. So this is a model of content creation, the me/us/them model, which the National Gallery of Denmark spoke about at a MuseWeb conference back in sort of 2014, 2015, I think. And I really like this, the way that they sort of explain the different types of content creation. So you've got the me, which you could basically see as the organization, so the organization's social media presence. So if we are thinking about the Museum of English Rural Life as an example, any message that they put out from their Twitter account is a message that they can control, that they can focus on the timing of, focus on the quality of, but as a pro. But obviously there's cons. It's time consuming, and also it's interesting to think about the credibility. So if you're speaking about something that you are doing, the credibility of that is much lower than if somebody else was speaking about something that you were doing. So if I was to say, come to my event, it's going to be really good, you'll enjoy it, the credibility of that is much lower than a stranger saying, you should go to Alex's event, it'll be really good, you'll really enjoy it. And that sort of brings me on to the us and them aspects of the model of content creation. So us you can think about as members of your museum staff who might create and share content on their own social media platforms. And in a sec, I'll show you an example of that and talk about an example from the Museum of London. The sort of like pros behind that is that you have some control of the message. It also helps with the internal awareness, as in like staff awareness of the use of social media. And you can also tap into people's expertise and knowledge without the need for tailoring the content yourself. And it's also a real human voice. versus the institutional voice, which often you find on social media platforms, particularly for larger organizations. Obviously, there are some cons, so the fact that it reflects directly on the institution if the quality is low, or if the quality is offensive or inappropriate, that will reflect on the institution, particularly as you are sort of highlighting them as a member of staff. There could also be the potential need for training for members of staff, but for me, I wouldn't necessarily see that as a con. I would see that as a pro, the opportunity to upskill your staff, to give them new skills, to help build their digital literacies, I think is actually a positive as opposed to a negative. But obviously it is time consuming to do that, so that is something that you need to think about. And then finally, we're on to the them model of content creation. And I think this is a really positive way of creating content. So if we're thinking about the Museum of English Rural Life again, the them aspect of their content creation, going back to their smocks, would be the smocks themselves that people are designing on Animal Crossing and then sharing through social media. They're sharing those smocks, sharing images of them, hashtagging and tagging the Museum of English Rural Life, and that's a really nice example of a sort of them, an audience content creation. You could also say the same about the Ashmolean and their isolation creations. So obviously the pros, incredibly high credibility, because these are individuals that have no real association with the organization who are creating content, talking about how great this organization is, or at least through their actions showing how great this organization is. It's also an opportunity to reach a much wider audience because you're tapping into those individuals' audiences as well. And it requires little museum effort in the creation of the content, but it does require effort from the organisation in the sort of like nurturing and fostering of those relationships. In general, these aren't things that just happen overnight. And an organisation like the Museum of English Rural Life, for instance, has been doing sort of like collaborative audience work. They've been very approachable and very sort of strong on social media for a long time. So they've built up those relationships. It's not something that they've just done overnight. Obviously, the cons is that you have no control over the message, which some organizations can be uncomfortable with. But I think when it comes to digital content creation, it's important to be open and it's important to be receptive to other ideas, other thoughts, obviously within reason. So just some examples of those. We've got Getty Museum. This is something that they did entirely themselves. They sourced all of the different source and contacted all of the different organizations to take part. They sort of ran the whole thing, created the videos, shared all of the content. That's very much an example of a me model. An us model would be the Museum of London's hashtag archive lotteries that my old colleague Adam Corsini used to do. Adam would basically go into the archaeological archives, do a live stream on Periscope, and he'd ask people to tweet him a number between 1 and 500. He'd then go to the corresponding number in the archive and show the individual, the thing that they got. This was something that Adam used to do on his profile, but it was something that the Museum of London would share and retweet and, advertise and talk about. So whilst the Museum of London wasn't creating the content directly, their member of staff was, and they were supporting him in that. And then moving on to the them model of content creation. Again, it's that smock example from the Museum of English Rural Life, or MERL. And also, things like RA's daily doodles that they've recently been doing. That Ashmolean example that I showed you. These are all really good, strong examples of the them model of content creation. So some top tips for content creation whilst in lockdown. All of these tips are potentially really useful. I'm not going to talk through every single one of them. I think something that I'd like to highlight is that don't be afraid to collaborate. I think this is a really good opportunity for organizations to be collaborative and to start collaborating both, with each other, but also with their audiences. So really think about that. And also they utilize what you already have and have access to. So things like digitized collections, video footage, pictures, and maybe in online collections, however you have access to them, I think it's important to utilize what you have. And we've seen some really creative and interesting examples of how organizations are utilizing the stuff that they already have in imaginative ways. And something that I just want to finish on is for this section is thinking about the accessibility of your content. And there are some really good organizations out there like Vocalize, the DCN, Stage Text, and many others that work and support the sector with creating accessible content. So please do contact them for help. It's really important that your content is accessible at the very minimum. Subtitling videos, as I've done here, but also like alt text on images. There's loads of different things that it's important to do, so do check out those organizations and ask for help. Here are a few ideas for communicating reopening. There's a lot of text here, so feel free to pause the video to give it a read. But I think that the one thing that I would really recommend is to start looking at how organizations abroad and also organizations here in the sector are communicating their reopening. At the moment, so I'm currently recording this in early May. Organizations in China, Germany and Italy are going to be reopening soon. So a lot of those are going to be communicating with their audiences, particularly on social media platforms, talking about how they're going to reopen, what that reopening might look like, what to expect. And I think this is a good opportunity for us as a sector to learn from what they're doing and to see how they're doing it, and to think about how we can do it for our audiences as well. And I think just to finish off for this section is to think about focusing and building and nurturing your online audiences. The organisations that have done well at the moment are those that have already put in that legwork. So I'm talking about like the Museum of English Rural Life, for instance. Very well known example, but their content is popular and their content works because they've put in that hard work already. Over the last few years, they've very much been a sort of gold standard almost for how organizations can use social media successfully through the excellent work of their social media managers, originally Adam Kazari and now Joe Vaughan. So now we're going to move on to some social media analytics. We're going to look at the what, the why, and a little bit of the how. But as I said at the beginning, this session is very much a sort of really quick introduction to social media analytics. We're going to run a more in-depth session later, either this month or next month, and hopefully we'll also have a sort of short video tutorial for that as well, which will hopefully be helpful. So let's start on the what. So what is social media analytics? The easiest way to explain it is that they're the inbuilt or free-to-use data tools that can help give you information and data on your audience and your content. So for the sake of this sort of quick session, we're going to be focusing on Facebook, which are Facebook Insights, and analytics on Twitter. It's basically the ability to gather data about your content and your audience, the content that you're posting on those social media platforms, and then make decisions based on the data that you collect, so that you can stop doing the stuff that isn't working and do more of the stuff that is. So the key features of social media analytics: you've got textual data, so tweets and comments, and that's the actual, the text of the tweets and the comments, and both tweets that you post and, posts that you share on Facebook, but also tweets that are sent to you and comments that are posted on Facebook as well. So we're talking about the actual, the actual words. So that also includes the network data, so the information on the people that are following or liking your content. And that network data includes things like their location, their rough age. This information can be really useful, particularly if you're sharing on social media a lot of events. So knowing, where your audience is based, particularly how many of them are actually close to your local area, can help inform how you share that content. So just posting lots of "come to my event" sort of, tweets and Facebook posts might not be very effective if only 10% of your audience are actually, near to your location. If you have a large international audience, you might want to think about how you can add interesting information to those event posts so that there's something for those individuals who are unlikely to travel to your organization to attend your events. You've also got actions and engagements, so things like likes, shares, and views, retweets, comments, all of those are actions and engagements on your content. You can also get hyperlink data, so the number of people who click links, and that can be really useful, particularly if you're trying to direct them to a specific web page. You can think about how successful the call to action, as in asking people to click the link in as many words, was by how many people actually click the link. You've also got lots of stats around videos, particularly on Facebook, lots of information around video views, how long people viewed the video for. Again, if you're thinking about doing more video content, looking at this sort of data can be really useful, particularly the sort of like 10-second video views. You can understand how many people only viewed a video for a certain amount of time, and you can look at, the drop-off points. So at what point of time in that video did somebody stop watching? And you can find an average, and sometimes you can work out that yes, maybe this part of the video wasn't that entertaining, and maybe that's why people dropped off. Theoretically, in your future videos, you could then think about, tightening up your content and making it more engaging. Or you could even think about re-editing the original video and removing or, shortening the parts that people didn't seem to like, to see if you can keep people watching for longer. And then finally, you have the elusive reach/impressions. Reach on Facebook, impressions on Twitter. This is a little bit complicated, but the easiest way to think about reach or impressions is to think of it as the number of people who saw, and I'm doing inverted commas, saw your content. So seeing is quite a loose term for these social media platforms. Basically anybody who the content appeared in their timeline, they may have scrolled past it as well. So even though the platform says that they've seen it, if you were to do a survey of the number of people who are included as a reach or impression who would actually remember seeing that piece of content, it would be very low. So one of the more important things that you can do with your analytics is to compare the reach or impressions with the number of actions and engagements. And that will come out as a percentage. And then both Twitter and Facebook do give you that percentage when you look at that information. And it basically gives you an idea of how successful a piece of content was. So you might think that if you shared a photo that had, let's say, 10,000 reach or impressions, if it only got 5 or 6 comments or likes or shares or retweets, whatever, even though 10,000 people saw it, it would suggest that the content wasn't that great because not a huge number of people sort of reacted to it. Whereas you might have a photo that only received 500 reach or impressions, but if 50 or 60 people commented, liked, shared that photograph, you might say that that was more successful than the one that reached more people because it had more engagements. Again, these are things that the more you do it, the better you'll understand what success looks like for you as an organization. So why use social media analytics? I think that's quite an important question because social media analytics, the process of analyzing your social media content can be quite long. And it is a dedication of time. I would say, try to do it at least once a month, maybe twice a month if you can, because it basically enables your content to work harder. You can understand what is working and what isn't working, and you can do less of what isn't working and more of what is. So you're spending less time sort of, just like throwing things out there, and you're spending more time being strategic and thoughtful about the sort of stuff you're putting out and making sure that your audience is actually enjoying what you're doing. Basically, you'll be moving away from the build it and they will come mentality. The idea that whatever you put out, everybody will like, because that isn't the case. Even more so at the moment with the sort of deluge of online and digital content, there's a lot of noise out there, and it takes a lot for an organization's content to sort of cut through all of that, particularly when you're competing with the likes of Netflix, the likes of, Prime Video, Disney Plus. These are all really valid reasons, and do feel free to pause the video to have a proper look through. But one thing that I will highlight is knowing what's working well will enable you to take better advantage of the boosting/advertising features of the platforms. Now, I don't necessarily encourage people to use Twitter adverts because they're not amazing. But as bad as Facebook is, their boosting and advertising aspects of their platforms are actually very good. you can actually reach a very large audience, and sometimes a different audience to the ones that you would usually reach, by using their boosting and advertising features. And you may only need to spend £5 to £10 to reach a larger number of people, and that's particularly useful if a piece of content is already performing well, if it's already getting lots of views, or if it's already getting lots of likes and shares and comments. By using that boosting, you're sort of just helping to expand the audience and keep that sort of snowball of interactions and engagements going. And I know of a number of organisations, even a number of museums, that won't actually post on Facebook now unless there's a little bit of money behind it to add to that boosting and advertising, because otherwise the content just isn't being seen by people. So the key metrics, and we're going to be focusing on the metrics for content as opposed to audiences, but the key metrics for content, you want to be thinking about the reach and impressions, so the number of people that are technically seeing your content. You also want to be thinking about the engagements, so the number of engagements that you're getting compared to the reach/impressions, so you're thinking about that percentage difference. But you also want to be thinking about the quality of engagements and what you want to achieve with the piece of content that you're putting out there. So let's say that I'm trying to start a conversation with a piece of content that I've put out on a platform. If it receives lots of likes and lots of shares, lots of retweets, whatever, but it doesn't receive very many comments, I would be rating comments as of more quality than likes and shares, because what I'm trying to do is start a conversation. You could even break that down further, and if you are trying to start a conversation, you want to be looking at the types of comments that you're receiving. So if you're receiving lots of comments that are saying things like "I like this" or "this is interesting," or people tagging their friends, that can be useful. But if you're trying to start a conversation, those types of comments aren't necessarily conversational. So you might then be rating comments that are actually conversational, that are actually a conversation, as of higher quality than those that aren't. And again, this is down to thinking about what you deem as a success and what you're trying to achieve with social media. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we come on to the strategy section. Something else that you might want to be thinking about is the growth rate. Particularly the more that you use social media analytics, you'll start to get a better idea of the types of content that your audience like to see. And you would expect that the more content that you're putting out there that is being well received by your audience, that your audience will grow as well, as will the number of engagements, number of impressions. So you want to be thinking about that growth rate. And you want to be thinking about how you're going to benchmark. So maybe you'll say you want X number of followers, X number of engagements, X number of impressions each month. And then you could set a number that you'd like to see that gain by. Of course, this is very superficial, and you want to be thinking about the quality of engagements and what you're hoping to achieve through social media. And again, this is something we're going to talk about when we come on to social media strategy. So the first key steps for analyzing your social media content, you want to be deciding what you're trying to measure. So, it's very easy to just measure absolutely everything, create a, bar graph or a spreadsheet with all of that data. You're probably going to find that that's not very useful, particularly if you're strapped for time. So what you want to be doing is thinking very specifically about what you're trying to measure based on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to be more conversational on social media, maybe you want to be measuring the number of comments or the number of shares or the number of tags that you're getting in a piece of content. You want to be thinking about how you're going to record the data and how you're going to analyze it. I like to use spreadsheets and bar graphs, but that's not to everyone's taste. You might also want to be thinking about how you're going to visualize this data, and particularly if you're reporting it, having infographics with the sort of like key headlines can be really useful for sending on to stakeholders, because it's something easily digestible, easy to see. It's a snapshot, and it can paint a really good picture of what you've been doing. You want to be thinking about what you notice and how you can put what you notice into action. And then you want to be thinking about how you can benchmark, how you can set yourself goals and targets that are measurable and achievable, smart, and how you can go about achieving those. So I'm going to really quickly show you my Twitter analytics, just so you can get an idea of what it looks like and where you can find it. So the first thing you want to do is go to twitter.com, and then once you're there, you want to click on more, and then analytics. So obviously I'm showing you my personal analytics for my personal account, but if you were doing it for your organization, it would be the same process. So there's a lot of red there, but understandable because I've not been doing as many tweets lately. So my tweets are down 59%. Looking at these top line statistics, impressions are down a similar percentage, as a profile visits, as I mentioned. That's kind of it's understandable, because if I've been doing 50% less tweets, you'd expect 50% less tweet impressions, less profile visits. So these numbers correlate. As you scroll down, you can see how you performed month by month. So April was a fairly good month for me, 52,000 impressions. March as well was a pretty good month, 88,000 impressions. Also tells you what your top mentions were, your top tweets, which is quite helpful, but a lot of this is very superficial data. So what you want to be doing is going to your tweets, and you want to be looking at the tweets themselves. Now, to remember what I was saying about that engagement rate. So the number of engagements divided by the total number of impressions, that will give you that percentage. So this tweet that I sent out today, 183 impressions, 9 engagements, 4.9% engagement rate. That's not too bad. This one's a bit better. So this is a tweet that I sent yesterday when I was running a training session. 992 impressions, so just under 1,000, 166 engagements, 16.7% engagement rate. That's a really high engagement rate, actually. So that would suggest that that was a successful piece of content. Again, it's going back to that thing that I was saying about what do you value as quality. So it had a low number of impressions. Usually my tweets average, somewhere between 5 and 10,000 impressions, depending on the tweet. The average for a good tweet, I'd say. The engagements usually are a lot lower, so the engagement rate usually sits somewhere between, I'd say, 2 to 5, 6%. So 16% is quite successful. You'll find that the more popular a tweet is, so the more engagements, the more impressions. So here, 5,666. But only 117 engagements, so the engagement rate is a lot smaller. And then I'd be thinking to myself, why was this tweet seen so many times? Well, it's because we were talking about digital chats. People were probably sharing and retweeting it because it's something that they thought might be useful for other people. So you can see that as a useful tweet. What I'd be doing is I'd be going through each month. I'll go through my 5 most popular tweets and maybe my 4 or 5 least popular tweets. And then I'd look at the content and I'd decide what made them popular and what made them unpopular. So this one here, 0%. This was a sort of quote retweet, no engagements at all. So that would suggest that it wasn't overly successful. Whereas this, a bit higher. Here you go, picture of my dog, and that did quite well. Obviously because it's a picture of a dog, and the dog is quite cute, even if I do say so myself. So, you can kind of gather an idea of why a piece of content was successful and why another piece wasn't as successful. You can make notes based around what you deem to be a success and what you deem not to be a success. And you can think about doing more of the stuff that works and less of the stuff that doesn't. So I'm just going to go back to my presentation now. So that was a really quick introduction to social media analytics. If you're thinking of an activity to do, I would really suggest that focusing on your 5 most popular tweets and your 3 least popular tweets each month, and just looking for correlations in the statistics, but also in the types of content that you're sharing. Thinking carefully about what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it, and making sure that that correlates in the data, I think is probably the easy first steps. Again, this is going to be followed on with a more in-depth look at social media analytics, and I very much encourage you to sign up for that session if it hasn't already passed, or keep an eye out for our video tutorial once we put it live. So last but by no means least, we're going to have a quick look at social media strategy. I'm going to be thinking about the what and the why. So what is a social media strategy? Well, I think the thing that's most key here to highlight is the fact that it's necessary for it to be unique to your institution. It's probably tempting to go onto Google and search for social media strategy for museums, and then to take the first one that you find and to remove the name of the museum that the social media strategy belongs to and enter the name of your own organization, and then, think done and dusted. But for a social media strategy to be truly useful, for it to be really impactful on how you use social media, how effective you are at your social media use, it really does need to be unique to your organization, unique to your museum, because otherwise there's no way that your strategy will line up with what your museum, your organization is hoping to achieve with its use of the platforms. So if you create a social media strategy that's unique to your organization, that really addresses those key aims and objectives, and really talks to your museum's mission, it can be a really useful document to have to very much guide your use of social media, to make sure that everything you do is strategic and strategically driven, to help you get to your end goals and objectives. So the main reasons to have one, it really helps to focus your content and to really understand your goals, and not just your goals of using social media, but also the goals of your organization and of your museum, and how your use of social media and in digital in general, but focusing for now on social media, how the platforms can really help your museum to achieve its mission, how the platforms are an extension of what your museum does in a physical setting. And again, it's thinking about that focus, that focus for your mission, being able to set measurable goals that are achievable, that are realistic, that are smart. Something that some organizations will do is set up a number of social media platforms, and occasionally those platforms get forgotten about. Having a social media strategy that sets out the platforms that you're going to be using and the types of content you'll be creating can help show commitment to the platforms, so that you don't run the risk of setting up a TikTok that is never used, for instance. Being able to regularly look back on this strategy and review the document will give you also an opportunity to think strategically about the platforms that you're using. Perhaps Facebook no longer fits your mission, or fits the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and maybe there's a platform that is better suited. It gives you that ability to be adaptable, but also strategic with what you're doing. Again, feel free to pause the video to have a look through some of these reasons if you fancy. I think the key thing that a social media strategy can give you and your organization is confidence. And I think often there's a sort of fear around social media, and a fear around what might happen if things go wrong. But having a strategy that's in place, that's a living document, that is regularly updated and checked, perhaps every 4 or 5 or 6 months, at least every year, it can really give you the confidence you need to achieve your goals and missions through these platforms. But I think it is worth saying that there's no rules stating that you need a social media strategy. It's not like Facebook is going to take down your account because it finds out you're operating without one. The most important thing is that the strategy is unique to your organization. And if it isn't unique, and if it isn't regularly updated and checked to make sure that it is still relevant for your organization, then there really is no point in having one. There's no point in spending the time in creating it, because if you're doing it correctly, it is an intensive process. It doesn't have to take a huge amount of time, but it should take some time to make sure that it is relevant and useful. The last thing you want is to spend a few hours creating a document that is just going to sit in your file systems without anybody ever touching it or thinking about it again. So really you want to be able to answer these 3 questions. You need to be able to answer why you need it. You need to be able to answer who is going to be using it. You need to be able to answer what it's for. And if you're not able to answer those 3 questions, then maybe you're not in a position yet to think about a social media strategy. And maybe you need to take a little bit more time to think about your overall strategy and how social media can play a part in that. So I'm just going to quickly show you a Google Doc. And this Google Doc I created for the training session that this is a recording of. The Google Doc is basically a list of questions that will help guide your creation of a social media strategy. As I said, because a strategy needs to be unique to your organization, I can't necessarily give you a, this is how you create a social media strategy. Here are the things that you need, take these things out and add in your own information. It should be unique to your organization, but there are some questions that you can ask yourself that can help guide your thinking around a social media strategy. Things like, why does your organization use social media? What are the reasons that they're currently using it? What do you hope to achieve through social media? How does it link to your organization's mission? What sort of content will you be creating, and what are the best platforms for that content? What does your audience want, and what do you think your audience wants? And where are your audience? What platforms are they on? What audiences are you trying to reach? I think, should your organization have a voice? This question here is quite an important one, because there are some organizations out there. I'm thinking of like the Museum of English Rural Life, for instance, which has a very specific voice. It's a very specific style of content, which is really successful, but it's very much their own. I'm not necessarily saying that you should go and copy that, but I am saying that you need to think about the type of tone and the type of voice that you want your content to have, and the platforms that are most relevant to share that. And also think about the strengths and the weaknesses of your organization, and also the strengths of your staff as well. Going back all the way to that hashtag Dougie Draws, which we talked about at the very beginning, I think that's a really good example of how an organization can think about the strengths of its staff and how they can utilize that on platforms, social media platforms. Obviously, that's happened as a result of the current crisis. But that could be something that you could think about proactively. Think of the strengths of your staff and how their talent, skills can really contribute to your use of social media. So I'm thinking about that Dougie Draws example, but also the example from the Museum of London and Adam Cassini that I shared, and how he was able to communicate to an audience through a live stream in a really imaginative and inventive way. Again, that's a talent that you could think about utilizing through social media, and how can those skills help you achieve your goals and missions, thinking about that strategy that's running all the way through. So I'm just going to go back to my presentation. So I'm going to link to this Google document at the bottom of this, not in the comment section, in the description section for this video. So you can follow that link if you want, and you can look at those questions and you can think about your own social media strategy. So a social media strategy that I really like is the US National Archives. Again, this is a large organization, so I'm not saying that your strategy should look exactly like this, but what I do like is, this is just a screenshot, and what I do like is the fact that they've sort of come up with an introduction, they've come up with a vision, they've come up with the goals that they want to achieve by using social media. And this is a document that was running from 2017 to 2020, so it's now out of date. But it was very much a living, breathing document, one that they were working on over those years to help achieve those goals. And you can very much see how their use of social media ties up with what they're hoping to achieve as an organization. So that about does it for this video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it informative, and that you've taken a little bit of inspiration from some of the social media examples that we shared. I hope that you understand the importance and how useful social media analytics can be. Even though it was a quick introduction, I hope that you felt that you've got a couple of things that you can take away and start doing straight away in your organization. Obviously, do feel free to either attend our upcoming analytics course or look out for the upcoming video around that as well. And then hopefully you're thinking a little bit more strategically about how you're planning to use social media. At the moment, I think there's very much an attitude of just sort of getting stuff out there and getting on with it. But the organizations that seem to have done the best during this lockdown, engaging audiences, are those that have been strategic with their use of social media. So I think that's everything for this video. Again, with the social media strategy session, do feel free to book on or to look out for the video tutorial when that's put out. But if you have any questions, just feel free to drop me an email, award@museumoflondon.org.uk, or on Twitter I'm at @thatmuseumguy, and London Museum Development is @LondonMuseDev. Again, we're always around, always happy to answer questions and help out. So I hope you found this video useful. Best of luck with all your social media work, and catch you in the next one.